Hello, this is Heather Lee, and this is part 1 of assessment for EDS 318. And we're going to be talking today about several things related to assessment. But before we begin, I'd like you to think what words come to your mind when you think about assessment. Just think of a few of those words, or maybe ways that you would describe assessment. And I also want you to think about, is assessment a positive thing or a negative thing to you? And I want you to think about that because your own personal experience with assessment and your approach to it really colors how you're going to view assessment for your students. If you are someone who does not like assessment and maybe you get nervous and have some test anxiety, then you're probably going to view assessment in a negative way for your students. However, if you happen to enjoy test taking and you like that challenge and you like the culmination of it, then you may have a positive, and you may think this is a good thing, and then you're confused as why some of your students think it's a bad thing. So our background in assessment and testing and evaluating, all of that has a role to play as future teachers. Now today we're going to talk first about a paradigm shift. Now a paradigm is, simply it's a way of thinking about something. And we're going to talk about kind of the old way, the old paradigm or way of thinking about assessment. And I want to challenge you to think about assessment in a new way. We're also going to talk about some key principles of assessment, and then we'll get into specific types of assessment, most likely in a future recording. Now, when we talk about assessment, one key thing I want you to think about is beginning with the end in mind. Remember, we've talked about Wiggins and McTee's understanding by design, and especially backward design. Planning in a backwards way. And remember, the first thing that we did was we identified the desired results. And that's where we look at the standards, we form objectives or learning goals, and we decide what our students need to know at the end. Now, that second step is where you determine the acceptable evidence. That's the assessment piece that we're talking about here. And normally people would think the test or assessment comes at the end. But we're going to determine before we even lesson plan what the end is going to look like. And then we will be able to plan learning activities, all the other things, the lesson plans, all those things, and we'll know that they're going to be aligned. Okay, remember, alignment is when everything clearly supports the other thing. The learning goals are clearly lined up with the standards. They're talking about the same thing at the same level. Our assessment clearly assesses our learning goals. They don't assess anything else, any more, any less. And every single class period, every single lesson has directly to do with those learning goals so that we can stay focused and not get off task, and we know whether we have been successful or not at the end. So beginning with the end in mind is a good way to think about this. Now, as far as a paradigm thing, a paradigm shift. On the left side of this table, this is the old paradigm. This is how, for many years, we thought about assessment. And on the right-hand side is a new paradigm. First of all, the first line, assessment is often considered something done to the students. We'll test or evaluate the students. But instead, assessment can be viewed as something that's done for the students and for the teachers. A positive thing that we can learn from. Another level is anxiety. Beforehand, you can view assessment as something that increases anxiety and makes us nervous. But imagine if there was a paradigm shift and we viewed assessment as something that we're eager to do because it shows how much we've learned. We want to take that test. We want to show the teacher how much we've learned. And it also can build our confidence and tells us, yeah, good job, we did it. We completed that project. We did that presentation. We showed how much we have learned. Another category, many times we take tests or get grades back, and we want to compare with other people. How did you do? How did you do? How did you do? Versus looking at assessment for self-improvement. How did I do compared to the last time? How did I do compared to the beginning of this unit? What have I learned? How have I grown? Another level of this shift is from this just being a test at the end. That's kind of the traditional way we think about assessment. Instead, assessment needs to be done before, during, and after instruction. Those are those three words: pre-assessment, formative assessment, and summative or post-assessment. And so assessment should be happening all the time, not just at the end. An old view of assessment would be about surprises. Students having to guess what's on the test, and aha, I gotcha, you weren't listening in that class, were you? And so instead of surprises, we want to have clear expectations so that students know how to focus. It really doesn't do them much good when there are surprises. I mean, we want them to know what they should study, what they should master, and have high expectations for them so they know what to learn and how to perform well on a test. And the last area of this paradigm shift to continue is, instead of assessing just for a grade, to have a number in my grade book, a 91, so that I can move on, or that I can have all the required grades I'm supposed to have. Instead, yes, we often have grades on assessment, but it's not just a number, it's feedback for the students, for us, for parents. It's feedback to let us know how are our students doing. So this kind of summarizes a paradigm assessment, and a couple other things along those lines. We want to think about assessment of learning. That's a more traditional view of assessment, that we're trying to determine, what our students have learned, and that's a very good thing. But instead, assessment for learning. What can we learn from assessment? Assessment of learning versus assessment for learning. I like this quote by Cheapius and Stiggins. They say that assessment should be an instructional tool that promotes learning rather than an event designed solely for the purpose of evaluating and assessing grades. Do we evaluate? Yes. Do we assess grades? Yes. But does that end culmination, does that learning tool, does it promote learning? Is it a tool that we actually use? I really like this analogy. In America, we say that if someone is suspected of committing a crime, we say that they are innocent until proven guilty. And if we think about our students in that way, we're the teachers and we're assessing our students. We should think like a juror, and we should consider our students innocent of everything, innocent of knowledge, understanding, and skills. In other words, we should not assume they know anything until they're proven guilty of that knowledge. So we need to imagine that they are blank slates in the beginning. Now, we know they're not. We know they have a variety of learning experiences and past courses and past teachers, but we cannot assume that they're coming into our classroom knowing what came before our unit. We need to know where they are. We need to know what they already know. And that's part of what assessment does. Pre-assessment, formative assessment, and summative assessment. We cannot assume that just because we've said something that they understand it. I mean, think about you in a classroom. When a teacher says something, do you always understand what the teacher is saying? No. A teacher cannot assume that just saying it or teaching it means that students are learning. We need to find out what they know. So assessment answers two vital questions. The first one is not the one we typically ask first. The first one is, how did I, the teacher, do? How did I do? And the second question, how did my students do? If you give a quiz, for example, and most of your class fails, you might hear a teacher say, oh my goodness, they bombed that. They must not have been listening. They are not trying. But the first person who should be evaluating themselves with poor assessment results like that is the teacher. Did I teach it well? Was it in a way that they could understand? Did I check in class how they were coming along? That's formative assessment. Did I know that they were following with me, or did I think they were lost and then I just gave them a quiz anyway? So we should be finding out what the teacher, how the teacher is doing first. That's number one. And then, how did my students do? And if we think along these lines, then that's a paradigm shift. That is a different way of thinking about assessment. In the next video, we'll talk about some key principles of assessment.